The Roman Empire once thought Britain was a myth, a legend, a barbaric island at the edge of the known world that probably didn't exist. They were wrong, and finding out just how wrong they were would take them over a century. But the story of Britain doesn't start with Rome. It starts almost 1,000,000 years before any Roman soldier ever set foot on this island. And by the time we reach the present day, this small island will have built the largest empire the world has ever seen, invented the language most of the world now speaks, and shaped the modern age in ways most people never stop to think about. This is the complete history of the United Kingdom. Stay with me. The earliest evidence of human life on this island dates back around 950,000 years. The first people to arrive were hunter-gatherers who crossed from mainland Europe around 8,000 BC, and they brought with them the earliest traces of what would eventually become an economy, trading elk, wild cattle, and pigs among themselves while defending against wolves and bears that roamed the land freely. Tools made from carved stone and hand axes survive from this period, and the rare discovery of wooden spears in Essex, believed to be around 450,000 years old, tells us these early Britons were far more sophisticated than their stone tools alone suggest. As the climate warmed and the landscape changed, these early inhabitants shifted from tracking reindeer and horses to hunting red deer and boar. By around 6,300 years ago, groups were setting up seasonal camps, moving between inland forests and the coast depending on the time of year, eating a diet heavy in fish and shellfish, and slowly developing the tools and curiosity that would push them towards something entirely new. 230 around 4100 BC, everything changed. Farming arrived from the east, and with it came the beginning of settled life in Britain. The land was cleared, fields were cut. The first domestic buildings appeared, long, narrow wooden structures called longhouses, and alongside them, monuments for burying and honoring the dead. The most famous of these monuments is Stonehenge in Wiltshire, built somewhere between 2600 and 2200 BC, and still standing today as one of the most remarkable structures ever raised by human hands on this island. Nobody fully understands its purpose, but the precision of its construction, aligned with the movements of the sun and stars, tells us the people who built it understood far more about the world than we often give them credit for. 330. By 2200 BC, Britain had entered the Bronze Age. Metal replaced stone, and with it came new weapons, more durable tools, and the first real boundaries around land claimed by dominant families. Daggers grew longer until they became the first swords made in Britain, and social tension between rival groups began leaving its mark on the historical record through damaged weapons and defensive earthworks. Then, around 1200 BC, iron arrived, and with it the Iron Age, a period that permanently accelerated the pace of civilization. Iron tools were stronger, lasted longer, and could be made in far greater quantities than bronze. Settlements became more permanent. Hill forts appeared across the landscape, defended communities that were the direct ancestors of the castles and towns that came after. 430, the most powerful group to emerge from the Iron Age were the Celts, a collection of tribes spread across Britain, Ireland, France, and Spain who shared a common language and a sophisticated culture the Romans would later dismiss as barbaric, calling them Keltoi, the Greek word for barbarians. Despite that dismissal, the Celts controlled large parts of the continent for centuries and left a legacy that still exists in modern Welsh, Irish, and Scottish languages today. 15 The Romans first came to Britain in 55 BC when Julius Caesar led his fleet across the Channel. It didn't go well. Twice Caesar attempted an invasion, and twice he was forced to pull back. It wasn't until 43 AD that Emperor Claudius succeeded, landing 4 legions on the Kent coast and beginning a conquest that would last nearly 4 centuries. The Romans built roads connecting London to York and the Welsh border, established cities, introduced Latin, constructed amphitheaters and bathhouses, and founded the city of Londinium, which would one day become London, the capital of the world. But British resistance never fully stopped. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe, led a devastating revolt that burned Londinium to the ground and killed tens of thousands before Roman forces finally defeated her. By the late 4th century, with the empire collapsing under its own weight, Roman Britain came to an end, and the citizens were told, bluntly, that they would have to defend themselves. 630, the centuries that followed, are often called the Dark Ages, and for good reason. Britain fractured into smaller kingdoms, Saxon raiders attacked coastal settlements, and organized civilization retreated. Then, in 793 AD, a new threat arrived from across the North Sea. Norse longships reached the shores of Britain, and the Viking Age had begun. For 300 years, Norse warriors raided, settled, and eventually ruled large parts of Britain. The sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, led by Ivar the Boneless, arrived in 865 with what the chronicles called the Great Heathen Army, sweeping through the 4 kingdoms of England and leaving only Wessex standing. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex, defeated the Danish warlord Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878, forcing a peace treaty that divided England and established a Viking-controlled territory known as the Danelaw. The Vikings gave the English language words still used every day, including the words sky, husband, ugly, and Thursday, which came from Thor's day. After nearly a century of coexistence, the last Norse king, Eric Bloodaxe, was driven out of Northumbria in 954, and the era of Danelaw ended. In 1066, everything changed again. The Norman Duke William defeated the Anglo-Saxon king at the Battle of Hastings, and became William the Conqueror, reshaping the entire structure of English society. The feudal system he introduced stripped Anglo-Saxon landowners of their land and distributed it among loyalists and the church. Stone castles rose across the landscape. Canterbury Cathedral was completed. The Tower of London was built, and a document called the Domesday Book recorded every piece of land in the country for the first time in history. The Middle Ages that followed were a period of enormous turmoil. The Magna Carta was signed in 1215, establishing for the first time that even a king had to answer to the law, laying the foundation for Parliament and modern democracy. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Britain, killing 1.5 million people in 3 years and returning multiple times in the decades that followed. The social disruption caused by so many deaths gave surviving workers more bargaining power than they had ever held before, triggering the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And between 1455 and 1485, the houses of Lancaster and York tore the country apart in a dynastic conflict known as the War of the Roses, which finally ended when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. 945. The Tudor period that followed was one of the most dramatic in British history. Henry VII united the warring houses through marriage, and his son Henry VIII reshaped the country's religion entirely. Frustrated by the Catholic Church's refusal to annul his marriage, Henry broke from Rome and founded the Church of England, a decision that altered the religious landscape of the entire nation. His 6 marriages, his desperate search for a male heir, and his 6 wives, 2 of whom he executed, made him one of the most recognizable monarchs in all of English history. The chaos his religious reforms caused lasted long after his death. His daughter Mary tried to reverse them, burning 300 Protestants at the stake in what became known as the Marian persecution. His other daughter, Elizabeth I, restored Protestant rule and went on to reign for 45 years, earning the nickname the Virgin Queen and presiding over an era of exploration, cultural flourishing, and growing national confidence. 11. The Stuart era that followed brought fresh turmoil. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605 tried to blow up the Houses of Parliament with the king inside. A civil war erupted in 1642, pitting Parliament against the Crown, ending in the execution of King Charles I and the brief rule of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. The Great Plague of 1665 killed tens of thousands in London, and the following year, a fire in a small bakery burned most of the medieval city to the ground. Out of the Stuart period came the Act of Union in 1707, formally uniting England and Scotland into a single Great Britain. 11. 45. The Georgian era brought the Industrial Revolution, perhaps the most transformative period in British history since the Roman conquest. Steam engines powered factories, canals connected cities. Coal mining expanded exponentially. Textile mills employed thousands, including children as young as 7, working in dangerous conditions for little pay. The country that had once been mostly rural became the world's first industrialized nation, producing goods traded across every corner of the planet. The Victorian era that followed saw the British Empire reach its absolute peak. At its height, the empire controlled territories so vast that the sun never set on British soil at any point in a 24-hour day. Railways covered the country. The telegraph connected it to the world. Social reforms slowly followed industrial wealth, with child labor laws, factory safety regulations, and eventually the first expansions of voting rights, beginning to reshape the rigid class structure that had defined British life for centuries. The 20th century tested Britain more than any era since the Vikings. The First World War, beginning in 1914, consumed 16 million lives across Europe. Britain sent millions of soldiers to the trenches, while women filled the factories, farms, and hospitals left behind. Then, just 2 decades later, the Second World War demanded everything again, with Britain standing almost alone against Nazi Germany in the early years before the tide finally turned. Out of that second war came the National Health Service in 1948, providing free health care to every British citizen, one of the most significant social achievements in the country's history. The empire gradually dismantled itself as territories across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean achieved independence. Britain joined the European Union to rebuild its trade relationships, then voted to leave in the 2016 Brexit referendum, beginning a new chapter whose consequences are still being written. On September 8, 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died after reigning for 70 years, the longest in British history, and the country entered a new era under King Charles III. 1430, from hunter-gatherers crossing a land bridge from Europe to a global empire, to the country navigating a new century without a queen. For the first time in 7 decades, the history of the United Kingdom is not a story of one thing. It is a story of constant reinvention. Every era tore down what came before it and built something new in its place. The language you are listening to right now, a language spoken by over 1 billion people across the world, came from this island. So did the common law that underpins legal systems across the globe. So did the Industrial Revolution, and the Parliament, and the idea that even a king is not above the law. That is the history of the United Kingdom, compressed into a single telling, from the very beginning to the present day. Nearly 1 million years of human presence on one island. Dozens of invasions, conquests, plagues, revolutions, and reinventions. A country that was once considered a myth by the most powerful empire in the ancient world, and that went on to build an empire larger than any the world had ever seen. Not a perfect history, not even close, but an extraordinary one, and one that is still unfolding. If you want to go deeper into any single era, whether it's the Romans, the Tudors, or the World Wars, let me know in the comments, and I'll take you there next.